Oh, yeah. Okay, here we are. Tom Fletcher's The Creakers, chapter 29, Lucy's Big Idea. So we're going to find out what she's got planned for the Creakers. Not long now. Literally 3 chapters left. Well, 2 and a kind of secret chapter. We'll find out about that in a bit. Okay. Only one more house, Lucy said to her dad as she wound down the window of his stinky rubbish truck. They pulled out outside Ella's house. Good evening. Good evening, Good evening, Mayor Noyen, Mr. Dunstan said, jumping out of his truck with a chirpy tip of his flat cap. The mayor came out of his front door, struggling with 3 heavy bags of rubbish, while Mrs. Annoying and Ella watched from the doorway, giggling quietly. Evening, Mr. Dunstan. Good evening, Lucy, he said. Lovely pyjamas, Lucy said, trying not to burst out laughing at Mayor's neatly ironed pink silk PJs. Thank you, Ella. Thank you. Ella got them for me, he mumbled. Are you all set for tonight? Yes, I think everything's ready, Lucy replied from the passenger seat of the smelly truck. Good. We shall see you at sunset, then, young Lucy. Fingers crossed your plan works, the mayor said. Mr. Dunstan threw the mayor's rubbish into the back of the truck and jumped into the driver's seat. See you there, Lucy called out to Ella and waved. They whizzed round Whiffington as the evening sun dropped low in the sky. Lucy, Mr. Dunstan said, no matter what happens tonight, I'm proud of you. Thanks, Dad, Lucy said. I just hope it works. Oh, me too, Lucy popped. Me too. They stopped off at their home, which was halfway through being repaired from the damage caused by the whopping great drill. Mr. Dunstan stepped out of the front door, edged her way round the scaffolding, and hopped into the truck with them. She was wearing her dressing gown and PJs and looked ready for bed. Oh, it feels so good to have you home, she said, throwing her arms round Mr. Dunstan's neck and giving him a big kiss. Not as good as it feels to be home, he replied with a huge grin on his face. Ready for the big night, then, Lucy Pops? Mrs. Dunstan asked. I am. I just hope they are, Lucy said with a hint of nervousness in her voice. They drove through the streets to a place Mr. Dunstan knew like the back of his grubby hand. The sign swinging outside the entrance read Whiffington Dump. But tonight it looked rather different. It was no longer Whiffington Dump, it was Camp Whiffington. As they pulled up through the gates, they were greeted by 2 familiar faces. Hey, Mr. Quirk. Hey, Norman, Lucy said as she jumped down from the truck. Is everything going to plan? Indeed it is, Lucy. The campsite is up and running, replied Mr. Quirk. No torches, right? Norman lifted up no torches, right? Norman lifted up a big, huge bag full of confiscated torches, and Lucy smiled. Everything's under control, Lucy. Scout's honour, Norman said with a salute. That reminds me, this is for you. He pulled a green and yellow scarf and a little woggle out of his pocket. He placed the scarf around Lucy's neck, fastened it with a woggle, and straightened it up. Welcome to Whiffington Scout Troop, he told her, smiling. Oh, do we have a new member? Norman's dad called, popping his scout leader hat on his head excitedly. Lucy looked into Norman's hopeful eyes and then round at the wonderful work he and his father had put into Camp Whiffington. Actually, it's 2 new members, Lucy said, noticing that Ella had just arrived. Hey, Ella! Hi, Lucy. Good evening, Norman, Ella said politely, being a cute little angel. Now her mama and papa were back. Ella, I've just signed you up for the Whiffington Scout Troop with me. You did what? Ella whispered in horror. That's right, you're a scout now. I'm certainly not. You are if you don't want your mama to find out what you went skipping through Whiffington in a wedding dress, Lucy whispered. Well, this is fantastic news, Mr. Quirks cried. New recruits are most welcome. We don't get many, do we, Norman? In such unusual circumstances, I'm delighted to present you both with your first Scout badges. And with that, he whipped out 2 circular woven patches and handed them to Lucy and one to Ella. They're starting a new adventure badge, he said. Lucy slicked her hair to one side, looked at the small patch in her hand, and felt her cheeks turn a little red. She couldn't stop the corner of her mouth turning up with pride. She glanced over at Ella, who was wearing the exact same expression, but quickly put her sunglasses on to hide it. They both suddenly knew why Norman took his badges so seriously. Norman proudly pointed to the same badge sewn on his jumper and gave them both a thumbs up. May I ask how you both came to hear about the Whipperton Scout troop? Asked Mr. Quick. Ella pointed her finger at Norman accusingly. Lucy nodded in agreement. Then, if I'm not mistaken, there is one more badge to be awarded tonight, Mr. Quick said, for getting one or more people to join our troop, for bringing people together. Norman got down on one knee and looked more like he was being knighted by the Queen than being handed a Scout badge by his dad. And there he is. There's his dad. See him? I award you the friendship badge, said Mr. Quirk, handing over a little badge. Lucy and Ella applauded as Norman stared at the badge. He let out a big sigh. What's wrong? Lucy asked. It's just, well, I've just wanted this badge for so long, Norman muttered, rubbing his thumb over it. And now I have it, Norm. And now you have it, Norm, Ella said, nudging him. Yeah, I know, but I've just realised it wasn't the badge I wanted, Norman said, his cheeks flushing red. It was the friends that came with it. Lucy put her arm round his shoulder and gave him a squeeze. I think I'm going to be sick, Ella mumbled. Lucy, Pops, it's nearly time, Mr. Dugston called. There was a huge crowd started to gather in Camp Whippington. Families were pitching tents and laying blankets on the ground. The smell of hot chocolate boiling over campfires hung in the air as the grown-ups shared stories of their time in the Wold, while the children kept their own adventures secret. Nearly sunset, Lucy heard them whisper. I wonder if they'll show up, said another. The crowd parted along Mr. Dugston's pongy vehicle to pull up. The crowd parted, allowing Mr. Dugston's pongy vehicle to pull up, with Lucy, Norman and Ella walking beside it. Mr. Dugston jumped out to join Lucy, and her heart pounded in her chest as something wonderful came into view in front of her. On the spot where there was once a great pile of stinking, rotting waste, now sat something marvellous, something genius, something only a child could think of. A whopping great bed. And had 4 thick tree trunks for posts. And as they got closer, a swarm of Whippington Air Force helicopters lowered a monumental mattress the size of a football field and a humongous pillow stuffed with hundreds of normal-sized pillows down onto the place on top of the bed. It was the most incredible thing Lucy had ever seen. There it is. Is the helicopter coming in? Although it was a bed fit for a giant to sleep in, no one could be lying in it. It wasn't made for sleeping in. It was the dark, dark shadow beneath the giant bed that really mattered. As Mr. Dugston and Lucy walked up to the enormous bed, the crowd cheered and whooped. There she is! That's Lucy! Lucy nervously unloaded the last few sacks of rubbish and tossed them onto the pile of stinking bin bags, old furniture and other bits and bobs at the bottom of the bed. She took a step back and admired the mountain of Whippleton's filthy, rotten garbage. The town's peace offering to the Creakers. There she is, admiring the rubbish. Then Lucy, her mum and her dad found a spot in the crowd, a little distance away from the enormous bed. Mr. Dugston rolled out 3 sleeping bags, then reached into his pocket and pulled something out. Fancy trying to beat your record, Lucy Pops, he said, waving a bag of jelly babies in the air with a smile. Impossible, her mum chuckled. Lucy and Mr. Dugston gave each other a look and both said at exactly the same time, Impossible isn't real. And the three of them burst out laughing. The sun slowly set over Whiffington. Everyone stared longingly into the darkness beneath the enormous bed, looking, hoping for any sign of movement. As the night drew on, with not a slight creak, flasks of hot chocolate ran dry, and the sound of tired yawns grew more frequent as the campfires calmed to a glowing embers. "I don't think they're coming, Lucy. Don't think they're coming," Lucy heard someone whisper. "It hasn't worked," said someone else. "Shall we go home?" "What do we do now?" "We wait," Lucy said. "Give them time." But time ticked on, and still there was not even the slightest sign of a creaker. Lucy stared as hard as she could into the blackness beneath the oversized bed, willing herself to see some sort of movement. But all she saw was the piles and piles of dirty rubbish sitting there, stinking out the night. Was this all just a silly, childish idea? Building a giant bed, collecting the town's rubbish in the evening, and leaving it out for the creakers to take? "Please grunt," Lucy thought. "Please guff," Lucy hoped. "Please scratch and sniff," Lucy whispered. She didn't dare take their eyes off the shadows. She just stared at the blackness, the darkness, the nothing. Nothing. Chapter 30. Wakey, wakey, Whiffington. It's a short one. I'll give it to you. This is the last chapter. Kind of. Lucy sat bolt upright. Her mind was racing, her heart pounding. Somehow, while staring at the shadowy nothing, she drifted off to sleep. It was still dark. Stars twinkled overhead, and she looked around Camp Whiffington and saw that everyone had done the same. Everyone was perfectly snoozing away. Old Man Carvery was wrapped up in his fluffy dressing gown. Paige Turner had fallen asleep with her nose in a book. Mayor Annoying was snoring into his megaphone. All was peaceful. Lucy sighed as she glanced down at her sleeping parents. Although her plan hadn't worked, she had succeeded in one thing, bringing her parents back. Not just back from the wall, but back together. She looked at their happy, sleeping faces, and even their eyes were tightly shut. She knew there was a lot of love in them, but that wasn't all Lucy saw. She leant in closer for a better look at her mum and dad and her dad's eyes. Her heart leapt. What do you think she might have seen? On the corner were the unmistakable little crumbly drops of dozy dust. She quickly glanced around at everybody else. They all had dozy dust in their eyes too. Slowly she raised a hand up to her own face and wiped the corner of her eye, and as she lowered it, her heart began beating so hard that she was sure it would wake everyone up. There, on the tips of her finger, were the little nuggets of golden dozy dust. She looked towards the whopping great bed, and a huge smile crept across her face. While they were all asleep, the enormous pile of Whiffington rubbish had mysteriously disappeared in the night, just like magic, just as Lucy had planned. It worked! Lucy whispered to herself, grinning from ear to ear. Her smile was suddenly greeted by the warmth of the rising sun. She peeked over the top of the 4 trees acting as giant bedposts and began chasing away the shadows. Lucy glanced around at her town as they lay snoozing, blissfully aware that her plan had worked, that Lucy, the kid, had found a way for them all to live together in harmony, that despite their differences, it was possible for humans and creakers to coexist. As the sunlight melted the night, replacing shadows with the warm orange glow of morning, Lucy looked at the last remaining spot of darkness beneath the giant bed, where 4 pairs of twinkling black eyes quickly disappeared into the world below. The end. Okay, that's it. Story over. I hope you enjoyed it. What did you mean? What happened next? I've already written the end. I don't think I'm allowed to write anything else after that. It's the rule. Oh, all right, maybe just a little bit. And you'll have that tomorrow. The epilogue. You can have that one tomorrow. That's it. Then we're done. No more.